Hi, everyone. My name's Toya with the International Socialist Alternative, and I want to welcome everyone back to our weekly virtual discussions on different topics every week. Before we get into what we're talking about this week, which is super exciting, I want to encourage everyone to share the event, start a watch party, post the link to your Facebook or to your Instagram to let everyone know about this discussion that we're having here today. Share with your neighbors, share with your mom. So let's get started. This is our fifth weekly broadcast we're having here during this COVID crisis. And we want to continue to produce these weekly International Socialist Sunday shows. So please show your support and appreciation. If you want to help us do that, consider making a donation. We could really use some new equipment to help make these streams the best that they could be. So I want to explain a little bit about this week and how we're going to be going forward. But first, I want to introduce our three speakers from around the world. We have Laura Fitzgerald, who's a member of the Socialist Party in Ireland and International Socialist Alternative Executive. Hey, Laura, how's it going? Next, we have Rob Jones, who's the founder of Socialist Alternative in Russia and also a member of the International Executive. Hey, Rob, good to see you. And lastly, we have Elon Axelbank, who's an organizer for Socialist Alternative in the United States. Good to see you, Elon. So I'm really excited for this week. We've been talking about workers in crisis over the past few weeks. Last week, for example, we focused on how women workers are especially oppressed under capitalism and the effect that that's having on them during this crisis. But this week, we're celebrating the birthday of one of the most important revolutionary leaders. You guessed it, Lenin. He would have turned 150 years old if he were still alive. And this conversation is not just going to be about Lenin, the man himself, but really diving into the influence of him and the Bolshevik Party and breaking through some of the sometimes controversies that surround him. So, we know growing up under capitalism, children learn in schools what the ruling class want them to. And sometimes for that reason, history can be whitewashed. So today we want to really have a discussion about who Lenin truly was and the effect that he has had over the world. So I want to encourage everyone who's watching to please comment and engage with the speakers, because we're going to get to a point where they can maybe answer some of your questions. So let's get to our first question. And this one's for Rob. Rob, Lenin was such a controversial historical figure, like I was mentioning. He was denounced by the international ruling class and still is as this great tyrant. But for socialists, we look at him as a positive reference. What is the true essence of his legacy? Hey, Rob, I can't hear you. Can you press unmute for me, please?
Okay, hello. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah, good. My mother always used to say, if the bosses are criticizing you all the time, you must be doing something pretty good. And I think that sums up really the attitude of the capitalists to the Russian Revolution, and in particular to its leaders. And of course, today we're discussing Vladimir Lenin, because when the Russian Revolution took place just over 100 years ago, the news of the revolution echoed around the world. It had workers out on the streets in support, discussing it, wanting to know what was going on, refusing to be sent abroad to go and fight the new revolutionary state and so on. And the reason being is that for the first time in history, workers in a large country, and in St. Petersburg in particular, they came out onto the streets. They set up Soviets. They got rid of the hated bloody Tsar Nicholas II. They tolerated 9 months of promises from the provisional government that was set up, which did nothing to implement its promises. And then, led by the Bolshevik Party, which in turn was led by Lenin and Trotsky, they took power into their own hands and they set up a new government. Now, we're used today to having governments making promises and when they come into power, doing absolutely nothing about it. But the new Soviet government, in a few short months, achieved absolutely incredible things. It withdrew from the First World War. It granted self-determination to several countries. It introduced Soviet democracy, gave people the right to vote, as long as they were over 18 years old, men and women. They declared equal rights of women, gave land to the peasants. It set up a free education system. Within 3 years, they set up 200 new universities, and I can see one of them out of my window at the moment. But perhaps most topical for today, they set up a universal, free for all state national health system, the first in the world, and it was aimed at establishing public health education and centres with the direct aim of eliminating epidemics in Russia. In the course of 30 years, life expectancy rose in Russia from 30 to 60. It was the Soviets that took power in November 1917. The working class organised themselves into democratically elected bodies with representatives of the workers, the soldiers and peasants. They set up their alternative governments. But it has to be said, without the leadership of the Bolsheviks, and in particular Lenin and his comrade in arms Trotsky, the revolution would not have succeeded. Lenin's legacy is this, the role he played in all these events. But he played a role not just as a leader of the Bolshevik party. It is an irony of history that actually he never presented himself as the head of the party. The title of General Secretary of the party only appeared when Stalin took over. But the role that Lenin played was not just to arm the party with its program, and of course there were many others involved in the discussions around this. Most importantly, it was Lenin's often sharp interventions during key events that helped change the direction of the revolution, leading to its eventual victory. We're talking, for example, in 1902, his intervention at the Second Congress of the Social Democratic Party, which clarified the difference between revolution and reformism that was supported by the minority in the party at that time. In 1905, as revolution spread across St. Petersburg, eventually across the whole Russian Empire, and the first Soviets sprung up, it took Lenin's intervention, a very sharp intervention, to persuade those who considered themselves supporters of Bolshevism in Russia at the time to start working with the new Soviets that had been sprung up. He attacked the liberals and the moderates who thought it was possible to reach a compromise with Tsarism. Instead, he called for a workers' and peasants' struggle, for a consistent democratic revolution, for a republic, for socialism. When he returned to Russia in 1917, that was also marked a turning point for the Bolshevik Party. Until then, the local Bolsheviks had supported the provisional government. But Lenin returned to Russia. He turned that on his head. He stood at the top of an armoured car, ignored the dignitaries who came to meet him, and spoke to the mass of the workers and the soldiers. The flames of the World Socialist Revolution are already burning. No confidence in the government. No confidence, withdraw from the predatory imperialist war, he called it. Nationalise land and banks and transfer power to the Soviets. It seems to me that that's a large part of his legacy that we have to take into account. His decisiveness, his willingness to oppose his own comrades if necessary. It was critical to the success of the revolution. And of course, then after the revolution, he still faced further battles, the civil war, the intervention by the army, and of course, the first signs of a development of the degeneration of the revolution, which he did his utmost to try and oppose as long as he was alive.
Thank you so much, Rob. And I mean, the list that you just said of all of the accomplishments, that it's just amazing. To me, that what stuck out is the life expectancy. It doubled. That's insane. Laura, what do you think?
Thanks, Toya. I'll just add, I obviously agree completely with everything Rob said. Why is Lenin one of the most maligned characters in history, and somebody whose legacy has been falsified more than anybody I can think of? It's because of the living role that he played. His legacy is, you know, Marxism for him was not a dogma. It was something that he used in a living, real struggle, in a revolution, like Rob explains. And what is a revolution except like real democracy, as in the mass participation of the working class, the poor masses in politics, and the ideas that he represented and the organization that he built was about giving the maximum power, working class agency, working class power, working class democracy, and organizing for that and fighting for that and building for that. His biggest legacy is the political force that he built to try and enable that sort of working class democracy and struggle and socialist change, and all the brilliant things that Rob explained of what that meant. And if you like, he's somebody that we have a special amount to learn from, because he applied Marxism, and the Bolsheviks are the only political force that achieved what Rob explained in terms of ending capitalism for a period. And I'll just say that's why for me he's so important, so interesting. And if you like, lots of the theoretical contributions that he made are so relevant today. So much of it is like things that I have a special interest in. For example, the question of fighting oppression and the whole approach that Lenin took, both in terms of fighting national oppression, but also the attitude that he had in general, how the working class could play a central role in fighting all forms of oppression, something that's really relevant today if you think of how young people are radicalized and politicized by the fact that there's still so much oppression, racism, sexism, etc., dug into this system of capitalism.
Thanks, Laura. And I actually want to go a little bit off of what you said. I know that in Ireland, there's, you've been involved with a lot of struggles for women's rights, for abortion, and just, fighting that type of special oppression that you mentioned. What are some of the contributions that Lenin made that are especially important for you?
Hi, Victoria. Nice question. I'll say, like, if you read, there's a particular passage in What Is to Be Done, literally written in 1902, where Lenin talks about what it means to be a socialist. And he was fighting sort of economism, a type of reformism, essentially, that just dug itself in the middle of the mass, say, trade union movement, and didn't try and bring pushing struggle and pushing socialism as your key role inside that broad movement. So that was the battle he was waging. But when he waged that battle, he made the point that a socialist and a worker socialist role is not just to echo whatever the mass demands of the movement are. Of course, you'll fight for that, but that you have to be a tribune of the people, taking up every aspect of oppression, and if you like, to aid the working class to free itself by making it aware of the way that the system oppresses people in so many different ways. And it's a brilliant piece that stands out, sparkles today. What it concretely meant. You take some of his closest political collaborators were female comrades in the Bolshevik Party, ones that went on to do pioneering things that he fully supported, like setting up Zenitol, like a women's kind of committee and commission after the revolution to ensure that the masses of working class and peasant women were fully involved in the struggle for socialism, and if you like, in constructing a socialist challenge. And part of that was to try and end and root out the inequality and oppression that had been so deep-seated in capitalism and all the class societies previously.
Thanks, Laura. I want to now go to Alon. We haven't heard from you yet, but in the U.S. It's a little bit different, but now a lot of people are turning to the ideas of socialism and looking for people like Lenin. What are some of the contributions that he made that are important to you?
Yeah, thanks, Toya. I agree with a lot of what Rob and Laura have been saying about the key stuff that Lenin contributed to the socialist movement, even today. The guy was born 150 years ago, and the stuff that he talked about is still totally relevant today. I feel like one of the main things that he contributed to the socialist movement is the need for, on the one hand, actually, that the working class is the key agent of socialist change. And he wasn't the first one to say this, but he really kind of solidified that. And I think the Russian Revolution really showed in practice, the truth to that. But that not just the working class is the agent of change, but that the working class needs to have a revolutionary leadership. And that Lenin talked about that, the best form for that taking place in a party, a revolutionary party. And he was definitely the first one to say that, the Revolutionary Party can't just make a revolution happen just on its own accord, whenever it wants. But it's the working class as a force socially that is able to lead a socialist revolution. But again, it needs to have a revolutionary program, or as we say in the United States, a platform, and a leadership. And so, what was Lenin's idea of like how a revolutionary party would work, or like what it, generally should be? He basically thought, and it's essentially the same thing that the International Socialist Alternative and the various sections think today, is a revolutionary party should be made up of the most politically kind of forward-thinking, most politically advanced members of the working class from all different sections, all different genders, races, religions, nationalities, etc., that can come together and kind of collectivize the experience that we all have in all our various, aspects of life and work and industries and stuff like that. We come together, we discuss, our analysis of what's happening in society, how as socialists we can engage in that and push things forward, and fight against the system and build the socialist movement. And we, kind of collaborate on common analysis and strategy. And then we go back out. The Revolutionary Party goes back out and puts forward as a unified force the stuff that the organization discusses collectively. And that was Lenin's conception of what was needed in the leadership of the working class in order to, really build the socialist movement effectively. And of course, for Lenin, it wasn't just that the Revolutionary Party kind of sat back and then a revolutionary situation arose and then they were like, huzzah, but that actually there was consistent activity of the Revolutionary Party throughout non-revolutionary times. And in some sense, the life of a revolutionary party is mostly spent in non-revolutionary times. And Lenin understood that the fight for reforms was actually a key aspect of the work of a revolutionary party. And that but that just fighting for reforms wasn't enough, that the goal of a revolutionary socialist party is to fight for reforms, but bridge the fight for reforms to the need ultimately also for socialist change to, really achieve, what the working class needed. And just one other thing I would say that I think is sometimes overlooked in terms of, what Lenin talked about and his contributions to the socialist movement was that he really underlined the role of young people and even students in the fight for socialism. And he talked about how youth were oftentimes kind of the catalyst or a catalyst for broader working class radicalization, and actually sometimes the foreshadowing of a broader working class radicalization. And I think, what Laura was talking about just a couple minutes ago, I think is a good example of that. And we've seen all across the world that some of the first people to move into struggle in the past few years have been young people, in many cases students. And Lenin thought that young people and students had a really important role to play in the socialist movement. And that students should absolutely not limit themselves to being student activists, but that students have a role to play in the socialist movement. The socialist movement has a role to play, in fighting on behalf of young people as well. So yeah, I think overall this balance between that the working class is the key agent of change, but that also a revolutionary leadership of the working class is necessary. To me, I think that's one of the most important things that he contributed.
Thanks, Alon. But before I move on, I saw Rob raising your hand. What did you have to say about this, Rob?
Well, I think Ilan touched on this, but I think we should never forget the importance of what Lenin contributed in terms of the right of nations to self-determination, and at the same time the need for workers' unity. Every time I see anything connected to this, I never cease to be amazed at how sensitive Lenin was on this question about the rights of national minorities. He fought for the right to go into the program as a key part of the social democratic program. And as soon as the Soviet government came into power, it granted self-determination, the right of independence, to Finland, Ukraine, Poland, and at least 6 other countries. And it's in stark contrast to the approach of the provisional government, which promised self-determination to Finland. And when Finland tried to take it, they invaded the parliament with the troops. Or the new Polish capitalist government that gained independence after the revolution and then decided to invade Lithuania and Ukraine in order to try and take them over. And it's not just a question of independence. Lenin always insisted that when Soviet officials or representatives went to other areas that were not Russian speaking, they should make every effort to speak in the local language or to get the ideas across in the local language, as opposed to some of the people who went from Moscow thought, well, everybody should speak Russian and they'll have to learn it. And if they don't learn it, that's their problem. They used that in the Red Army. The old Russian army, they used to send conscripts all over the place. The Red Army had a policy that you serve in the Red Army, even during the Civil War, in your own area. and commanders spoke in the local languages. So that meant that they were able to get an ear of the local minorities. And in some cases, of course, locally they were in a majority. And that helped to win the Civil War, because the imperialists, of course, still thought that Russia should be one country. And today, when we see that under capitalism, the national question is still such a major problem in many parts of the world, this demand is extremely important. And it's clear as well that genuine independence can only be possible if it's linked with a fight for socialism and a fight for workers' unity in those areas that are taking place. I think that's a very, very major part of his legacy that we shouldn't forget.
Thanks, Rob. It seems like Lenin was really ahead of his time, because we still have people, the ruling class of the world today, who are saying, I know in America, I hear it all the time, we're in America, we're going to speak American, we don't want to learn Spanish, things like that. And so it really seems like Lenin was ahead of his time. So now we're going to go to a question from the comments. I have a question from Sebastian in Germany. And before I go to his question, I want to let everybody know that we have people from every single continent on the globe right now watching. So please share this video. Even if you're not sure if people would, want to check it out, share it widely, because a lot of people are tuned in. So Sebastian is asking, he says, this period is dominated by a strong mood against political parties, especially amongst the youth. What does that mean for Lenin's idea of a revolutionary democratic socialist party today? So let's go to Laura.
Oh, thanks, Toya. Good question, Sebastian. So I just want to start by saying, in answering this question, that myself, I think all the activists within the International Socialist Alternative understand completely why there's an anti-party mood in many countries around the world. It's been a huge phenomenon of the last decade. And I think that it flows from the fact that parties that in the past, were parties connected with the working class movement, that were supposed to stand for socialism and so on, and to support the working class, how completely sold out, entered capitalist governments, capitalist arrangements, implemented austerity, etc. And that's the context in which there's a huge questioning of parties as a whole. And then the specific, any aspiring young socialist coming up worth their salt is going to have to ask a question about Stalinism and be completely opposed to Stalinism, as we are, and go and study the real lessons of what Lenin's life and works and struggles were, so that they understand that it's completely and utterly separate from Stalinism. And specifically what the Bolshevik party that Lenin built was about. It was about organizing a party based on a program and a perspective. And that program and perspective was specifically a revolutionary program and perspective. Recognizing, as Alain has explained in his contribution, the central role of the working class, only fundamentally put this party's fate is in the working class, and the mass struggle of the working class as the only way that we can fight Tsarist dictatorship, landlordism, capitalism, etc. And if you like, that organizing, that could be a way to bring all the poor and oppressed behind that movement, but that was vitally central to the Bolsheviks' vision. And if you look at, you could go and look at, compare and contrast the approach of another brilliant socialist, imperialist socialist in many ways, Rosa Luxemburg, working in Germany at a similar time. Both Rosa Luxemburg and Lenin, say early 20th century, were fighting a very similar ideological battle within the working class movement in terms of fighting reformism and the problems of a beginning of an accommodation to the system, an accommodation to capitalism, and an illusion that you could achieve socialism or socialist change gradually and by kind of making alliances or being soft on the capitalist elite and their classes and parties, and the idea that you could work with them, basically. They fought a similar battle, very hard ideological battle. But the difference in approach that they took was that Lenin actually organized all the people, all the working class and socialist activists around that specific program within the broader movement. Whereas, Rosa worked within the broader left party and so on. And in the end, that party was, that party became a vehicle to support the status quo, because the leadership themselves had done exactly what the young people that fear parties are worried about, which was sold out, supported the system, and, if you like, participated in a repression of potential revolution. And so, therefore, the fact that Lenin achieved this when there was, in terms of the victorious revolution, when there was revolutionary struggle happening and movements building up all around Europe, all around the world at that time, it is a lot down to the party that he built. And it's not, the party that he built is about 100% implacable approach to standing for revolutionary socialist change. That's what it's about more than anything. And if you like, it's a very democratic impulse as opposed to anti-democratic, because it's about working class power and agency that Lenin embodied in every way.
Thank you so much, Laura. Ilan, what do you think?
Yeah, I totally agree with what Laura was saying, and I get where the question is coming from, especially given that at least in the U.S., most of the political parties we have are really crappy. I definitely am not a big fan of the Democratic Party. I'm not a fan of the Republican Party. I think they mostly defend corporate interests. And so, yeah, there's a question, well, should we have a socialist party if these other parties aren't working? But I think I totally agree with what Laura was just saying. And I think it's also instructive to look at, like, how did the Bolshevik Party organize itself, and what lessons do we take from that in the way that the various parties and sections of the International Socialist Alternative, how do we organize ourselves? And what we use is something called democratic centralism, which was definitely used by the Bolsheviks and kind of really developed in large part by the Bolsheviks. I think it's useful to go into, like, well, what is democratic centralism, and when used right, why is it useful? And basically, in short, what this is a way of organizing, a socialist party where there's full freedom of democratic discussion, debate, and stuff like this. But then when decisions are made, that there's unity in action, and people go out and act together. And all major decisions that are made by the party are discussed at the national level, discussed at the local level in the branches of the organization, by leadership bodies, et cetera. And all decisions are subject to review afterwards. Because it's super important to understand this. And of course, the capitalist parties, they do not value the input of regular working class people like us. They don't care about that. But in a socialist party, a revolutionary party, that's one of the most important things. And so, because we don't think that just one person, Lenin was in many ways an exceptional human being, and was right quite a lot of the time. But even Lenin wasn't always right. And there's really no one person that's always right, or one small group of people that's always right. And so the collective experience of the membership of a revolutionary party is of the utmost importance in order to figure out, actually, well, what's the correct analysis for a situation? What's happening right now in society? We got to talk about it. What should socialists do about it? How do we orient towards what's going on, and build the socialist movement? So I think that's one part of democratic centralism, is the kind of democracy aspect. But of course, that needs to be balanced out with a degree of centralism. And that's where the second word of democratic centralism comes from. And I think everybody who's watching now, I'm sure all of us who are on this call ourselves have been in a meeting or a political activist group, or even like a group of friends where you just can't figure out what to do. You're just nonstop discussing and debating and arguing with each other, and a decision is never made. And the same risk of that is actually present in the socialist movement. And so there needs to be structures by which, once a decision is made, everybody acts together. And that's what allows groups like, Socialist Alternative and International Social Alternative, I think, to be so effective, and in a lot of instances kind of punch above our weight, so to speak, or like have a bigger influence than our numbers might suggest. And also, while yes, people need, we need to collectivize, everybody's experiences in a revolutionary party, and this is certainly Lenin advocated for this as well. There also, if we had an approach, and if the Bolsheviks had an approach where like every member of the Bolshevik Party participated in every decision that was made, they never would have, been able to lead the revolution in October 1917. If Lenin and the Central Committee had to poll every member of the Bolshevik Party, be like, hey guys, are you ready to have a revolution? Then that would have taken quite a bit of time because the Bolsheviks had grown to be quite big at that time. So obviously we need to have, under democratic centralism, you have to have an elected leadership, that is capable and kind of empowered to make decisions like this. And Lenin was all about this stuff. Lenin, in many ways, developed a lot of these ideas. But I guess just the last thing I would say about democratic centralism, and I think something that's important for the question that's asked, is like, well, is a democratic socialist and a democratic centralist party still needed today? How do you prevent a party like this from becoming bureaucratized or becoming kind of like a one person or a small group of people from trying to concentrate power in their hands? And I think, maybe we'll get to this later, but that's certainly, unfortunately, what happened in the Soviet Union after a period of years. And I think the number one thing, and Lenin talked about this all the time, and it's a huge lesson for today, is that you have to have an experienced membership of the party. The membership has to be confident, have to have a high political level. And Lenin was not interested at all in a party where it was just the leaders, where just Lenin, was a really smart guy and everybody listened to him. And just Lenin, wrote books and read theory and history and stuff like that. But the whole membership has to do that and be confident to hold each other accountable. And, the idea of, a revolutionary party being made up of independent thinkers that are capable of using a Marxist analysis to develop what is the right approach and discussing that collectively. That's really what Lenin tried to build and what he did contribute to building. And again, what we're trying to build today. So yeah, I think it's understandable certain kind of concerns about that, especially when looking at the capitalist parties today. But a socialist party, a revolutionary party, is of a totally different character. And I think democratic centralism is really it's invaluable in doing what the socialist movement needs to do today.
Thank you so much, Alon and Laura, for your responses to Sebastian's questions. And I think the intricacies of how to build a party are extremely important. Maybe you're watching this and you're like, I've thought of this before. I've wondered of this. I've heard of democratic centralism. I've heard critiques of it. Or maybe you're like me when I first got involved with socialist politics and had never heard of it, never thought of it. I was just pissed off at the manager of my restaurant for making me work for free. Maybe you want to do something. Maybe you've been wanting to do something for a really long time. We have sections of International Socialist Alternative on every single continent. And like Elon mentioned earlier, we need to build a revolutionary party that can unite the diverse sections of the working class. During this COVID-19 crisis, we are still working to build movements against capitalism and organizing under a socialist program. So take a few minutes after this live stream and check out our website. Check out our Instagram, check out our Facebook, read our material and watch our videos and join our organization. This crisis is showing workers and youth across the world that this system of capitalism is completely unsustainable. So I really, really encourage you to join Socialist Alternative. Enough of me talking, let's get back to the panelists. I have a fourth question for the group and we're gonna go to Rob. Rob, a big question in a lot of viewers' minds will be, inevitably, despite Lenin's nice ideas, didn't he lay foundations for what became a brutal dictatorship?
Well, this is a key question. And I don't think there's any justification for saying that Lenin was to blame for Stalin and Stalinism. On the contrary, I think as socialists, as Marxists today, we are more horrified than anybody at some of the crimes that Stalin committed in the 30s and later in order to maintain himself in power. But I think what we should do is we should remember that the revolution in Russia was not made by one person. It wasn't a result of a clever idea in somebody's head. It was a struggle of living forces. It was a class struggle between the old Tsarist autocracy and the barely developed capitalist system and the landlordism that existed on the one side, and the workers who were still relatively weak in numbers, and the very, very large peasantry that existed in the country. And it was this clash between forces that caused the revolution, that couldn't have succeeded if there hadn't been the Bolshevik Party. And as we've seen as well, the Bolshevik Party would not have had the right position if at key times Lenin hadn't intervened in the way that he did. But because it was a clash between living forces, it also meant that as long as the revolutionary forces were going ahead, of which Lenin was the key representative, things were okay. But then when the revolutionary forces started to have to retreat and reaction started to set in, we saw somebody else come to the head of it, and that was Stalin. In other words, Lenin was a representative of the progressive revolutionary move forward, and Stalin was a representative of regress, of reaction, and of conservatism. So in other words, you can't in any way blame Lenin for what happened later. But we do have to understand as well why it happened. I think Lenin had the right approach because he understood that although the revolution had started in Russia, Russia was still a relatively backward country. And actually, even if it had started in Germany or America for that matter, any country, it couldn't have existed in isolation from the rest of the world. If a socialist country anywhere in the world had been surrounded by capitalist countries, it would have only been able to survive for a certain period. And therefore, Lenin and the Bolsheviks argued very firmly, very consistently, that the only way that the Russian Revolution could actually win was if there had been a development of world revolution, a process which started, but unfortunately didn't come to completion in countries like Germany, in countries like Hungary and elsewhere, because of the lack of a Lenin, because of the lack of a Bolshevik party in those countries, that it could have taken things forward. And what do we mean by a retreat of the revolution? It wasn't that Lenin and the Bolsheviks sat down and said, okay, we have to step back now. It was because, again, of the particular events that took place. After the revolution, Russia was invaded by 14 imperialist armies. They gave open support to the White Guards, to the old monarchists, the old reactionary army officers. They carried out a brutal policy across the country, including anti-Jewish pogroms across the whole of the Ukraine and other areas. And the Bolsheviks found themselves in a situation where they pulled out of the First World War. They wanted to live in peace with other people, but they'd been invaded and they had to defend themselves. And they were put in a position where many of the best young workers from the factories, who should have been helping to restore production after the war, who should have been taking part in the Soviet, who should have been taking part in managing the economy, managing the new society, had to go to fight on the front. Many, of course, of them never came back from the front, unfortunately. And it meant that in their place, you started to get creeping in the old civil servants from the old Tsarist times with their reactionary ideas, their idea that they knew better than everybody else. That was one thing. Of course, you then had the delay of the World Revolution taking place. And by degree, you started to see the crystallization of a bureaucratic elite that through time, by the time they'd reached the late 20s and 30s, in effect, they'd carried out an open counter revolution, a political counter revolution. They kept the planned economy, they kept state ownership, they kept the name, unfortunately discrediting the name of socialism, but almost everything else they rejected. For example, the right to abortion that was introduced by the Bolsheviks, I think in 1920, they removed that in 1936, I think it was. The same with a whole number of things. Democratic rights are stepped back. They arrested the old Bolsheviks. They murdered thousands of people. I had the trying to think how to call it. I visited Vorkuta a few years ago, which was the site of one of the worst of Stalinist camps, and I visited the graveyards where you just had the wooden crosses in the ground. And it's extremely moving because you knew that many of those crosses were former members of the Bolshevik Party. Many of them were open Trotskyists because there'd been a Trotskyist uprising in the camps in the late 30s. And that was the only way Stalin can consolidate his power, by forcing out the old Bolshevik ideas, the ideas of Lenin and so on. And it was Krupskaya, Lenin's wife, who actually said if Lenin had been alive in the 30s, he would have been in one of Stalin's camps as well. But Lenin did see this before he died. He died in 1924 after basically a number of serious strokes that were probably a result of an assassination attempt in 1918. But he did see that beginning to happen, and he started to make some steps. He warned against Stalin becoming a center of bureaucracy. He warned against Stalin's approach on the national question. For example, Stalin was responsible for drawing up plans to set up the Soviet Union. And Lenin went mad when he saw them, because what Stalin was saying is that the independent republics, Soviet republics, should become part of a new Soviet Union by joining the Russian Federation. And Lenin just said, no, that's impossible. You can't do that. They have to be part of an equal federation. In other words, Ukraine and Russia would have the same status within that thing, and a whole number of other issues that Lenin became very critical of Stalin on. He saw it beginning. He started to work with Trotsky to try and put it ahead, but unfortunately, time and the objective situation were against him, and the result is over a period of time, there was a political counter-revolution that succeeded and took over power from the Bolsheviks. We have to learn from those lessons and make sure that we do understand that internationalism is key in our work. It's not just a nice idea, it's critically important if we really want to have a socialist society.
So on the contrary, Lenin actually saw what was developing and tried to react to that, but unfortunately he was ill. Let's go to Alon. What do you say to people when they ask if Lenin is the one who started this brutal dictatorship?
Yeah, I mean, it is honestly one of the most important questions when talking about Lenin's legacy, and I totally agree with the stuff that Rob was saying. And I think, yeah, it's in some senses it's an ironic question, because it's actually Stalinism itself and the way that the Soviet Union ended up evolving that has prevented so many people from drawing the same conclusions that Lenin drew, and that the original Bolsheviks drew. And I would say even myself, like I remember when I first, like in high school, like I have a memory actually of one of my history teachers spending just a few minutes talking about like the theory of socialism. And I remember being like, wait a second, that actually sounds good. I thought socialism was bad. Like what the hell? But I think, and so it's unfortunate that actually Lenin is associated so clearly with Stalin, and it's important to be clear on, well, what actually happened, like what Rob was just laying out. And I think, yeah, the stuff that Rob was saying, like, I mean, abortion rights, same-sex marriage being legalized decades before everywhere else. I mean, let's be clear. Same-sex marriage in the US was legalized, I believe, in 2015 or 2016, 100 years after in the Soviet Union. Women were given the right to divorce their husbands, and they had the economic means to do so. Voting rights were given to everybody, including women. And this is before the US, had given women voting rights. In Britain, only property owning men over the age of 21 could vote. And so, like, contrary to this idea that Lenin established and the Bolsheviks established this dictatorship, early revolutionary Russia was actually extremely democratic, far more democratic than actually the United States, for instance, in 2020. And of course, that's not to say that things didn't change. They did develop in not a great way for the reasons that Rob was laying out. And there's many other stuff that we could talk about how democratic early Soviet society was. But I think, like, why it's important to look at, well, why were all of these democratic reforms made? Again, it wasn't because of some like nice idea at the top or nice person running things. It was because of the foundation of early Soviet society of workers' democracy. That was the basis for the early development of the Soviet Union, that you had Soviets, which all that Soviet means, I certainly didn't used to know this, or I wasn't taught this in school. Soviet just means councils. It means workers' councils. And that was the basis for the new socialist society in Russia. It wasn't the Tsar, the Tsar or capitalists that were running society and government, but it was the workers' councils from the bottom up. And even in the workplaces, like there would be time out of the workday in all the factories and workplaces for workers to come together and have meetings of the Soviets to figure out, okay, how's things going? How's production going? How's distribution going? What could be more effective? Stuff like that. And so really, I say this to illustrate that that early Soviet society was democratic. Things developed along a bad way, when Stalin and the bureaucracy took over. And so in terms of, well, what happened after that, like Rob was saying, that that Lenin started to speak out to that and started to kind of issue warnings about how things were going. And he wasn't the only one. Unfortunately, Lenin got sick in like just really only five or so years after the revolution, and then died 7 years after the revolution. But Leon Trotsky and a bunch of others in the Soviet Union and around the world too started to come together and speak out about the bad direction that they saw things developing in. And they formed this thing called the Left Opposition, which was a group within the Bolshevik Party, or which had at that time kind of been renamed the Communist Party, and the International, the Third International, or the Communist International across the world. And as punishment for speaking out, just showing their ideas and being independent thinkers, like what we were talking about before, because they were raising ideas against Stalin. In 1927, they were kicked out of the Communist Party, and in 1929, Trotsky was exiled literally for the rest of his life from the Soviet Union, and this was completely insane. And as Rob said, like people who had thought along the same lines as Lenin did before he died, and with Trotsky and everybody, or even if Stalin was paranoid that you were thinking like that, you were persecuted, and many of them were killed, as Rob was saying. And so, I think we have to be clear that the dictatorship that developed in the later Soviet Union and the way that they ruled politically, that has nothing in common with what Lenin and the Bolsheviks were going for. And we should be clear about that. And today, the International Socialist Alternative, we consider ourselves Trotskyists. And I think it's worth just saying briefly, like, well, what does that even mean? And how did that term arise? And I don't think we have time to get into it here. Maybe it's something we could do another time. But the way I see it, Trotskyism was just the continuation of real Marxism in the face of the Stalinization of the majority of the Marxist movement across the world. So it's not that Trotskyism was some like big kind of grand deviation from Marxism. It was Stalinism that was the deviation, and Trotsky and the people that he was working with, they were really continuing to push for the original Bolsheviks ideas and real Marxist ideas. So I think and if that's appealing to you, definitely get involved with the International Socialist Alternative in our sections in the various countries, because as we've just been talking about, like history's not made by one or two people, it's made by the working class. So I think anyway, I'll stop there, but I think this is a very important discussion.
Thanks so much, Alon. So we have time for one more question, and I want to take a comment from Paul. I'm so glad, Paul, he's from England. He asked this question. We're all stuck in the house with, lockdowns and quarantine and stuff. So this is the perfect question for the time. He asked, which one of Lenin's writings would you most recommend? And I want to make sure that we have each person say their recommendation. And also keep in mind that you can get all of Lenin's texts online for free. So let's start with Laura. What's your recommendation?
So I think I'll go with the fabulously named Left-Wing Communism and Infantile Disorder. The reason for that, two quick reasons are, one, because it actually shows all these horrible cliches about Lenin, that he was some sort of doctrinaire, megalomaniac, many other horrible words, etc. He's actually fighting against, within the work, this was from 1920, this document, fighting against an approach in the working class movement that was removed. It was like, okay, we have all the right ideas. We know we need a socialist revolution, and the working class are key, etc. But we're not going to dirty our bid by getting involved in one of those reformist backward trade unions or this parliament that's, yes, and it was, not a real democratic parliament. It's a bourgeois institution, etc. We're not going to go and be involved in that because we're proper revolutionaries. He was fighting against that, saying, no, we have to go to where the masses of the working class are, and we have to build struggles, build movements, and raise working class consciousness so that the masses come on board for the socialist struggle. That you can't only base yourself on the workers that have already drawn those conclusions. We have to organize those workers and young people to affect the broad working class masses. And then that's number one. And number two, actually, because it also shows his internationalism, the points that Alon was making there, fundamentally the revolution degenerated in Russia because it was isolated. It was never the perspective of Lenin that you could just have this island of socialism in Russia. or anywhere, but certainly not in a country like Russia that was so backward and underdeveloped economically and so on to begin with. And it was always about world revolution. But the problem they had, the Bolsheviks were isolated because they wanted to build an international revolutionary party, but they had kind of the problems of the previous international supporting the First World War, sellouts, etc. Some of the points I made about reformism earlier meant that that hadn't been built. So he was consciously, 1920, intervening with the best socialist fighters in Germany to ensure that they took the right approach to maximize the potential for the working class to take power there. A complete sign that he was, even in the midst of this revolution, 1920, a couple of years after the revolution in Russia, fighting, writing material, intervening to try and spread the world revolution. That's it, Toya. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much. Laura, can you repeat the book one more time and also show everyone your amazing earrings, because I want to look at them too. They are so fitting for the discussion today. But yeah, just repeat the book that you said.
I will. I thought you were going to say lifted the book. I do have it here. Left-wing Communism and Infantile Disorder. And thanks, Frida earrings. Thanks, Toya.
Thanks so much, Laura. Rob, what's your recommendation for our viewers today?
Well, I can't show you any earrings, that's for sure. Well, I think I'm going to talk about the April thesis, because it's probably one of his shortest works. But it's one of the things that went like a bolt of lightning when he returned to Russia, and he cut across the hypocrisy and the cowardice of those people who were trying to compromise with the old regime and with the capitalist government that was still trying to carry on with the war and was refusing to give the rights to the nationalities and so on and so forth. And it's just a very short little document. There's 10 points in it, but it says everything you need to say. No support for the bourgeois provisional government. End the imperialist war. Set up a Soviet government. Abolish the police, the army, the bureaucracy. The next one's a good one. Salaries of all officials should be who should all be elected and replaced at any time should be at the level of the average of a skilled worker. Land should be confiscated. The landed estate should be confiscated so that the peasantry can have land to work on. And then, of course, he finishes with the need for a national bank. And then, as Laura has just said as well, he calls for the setting up of a new communist international, the Third International, because of the need to have a world revolution. That's the April thesis. It sent a bolt of lightning through the socialist movement when he returned, and it set the stage for the victory of the revolution in Russia 6 months later. I think it's a very good little article to read.
Thanks so much, Rob. Sometimes shorter is better if we don't have enough time to read a whole book. So the April thesis is a good suggestion. Alon, what's your suggestion for our viewers today?
State and Revolution. It's definitely a classic, I think, by Lenin, maybe one of his most well-known ones, I'm not sure. But he really goes into like, what role do institutions like the police, the military, the court system, and just really the government as a whole play in capitalism, but also like what role do those institutions play in class society in general, and how should socialists approach them, and what happens to the police under socialism? What happens to the military under socialism? What does the government look like under socialism? It really goes into that. It's not long at all. It's like 100 pages or something like that, 6 chapters. You read a chapter a week for 6 weeks, or 2 chapters a week if you're quick, and you get it done real quick. It's super useful. But actually, I would just say that my favorite line in that whole book is the last line of the postscript that he writes, where basically the book was written in August 1917, so just a couple months before the October Revolution. And basically he says that, I was planning to write the 7th chapter and make this into a whole much longer book. But he basically says, well, actually, it would be much more pleasant and useful to take part in the revolution, tend to write about it. So, I'll see you later. And this is my favorite sentence in that book, and maybe my favorite sentence that he ever wrote, because I think that it shows the essence of what Lenin was all about, that he was not some, stale academic or crusty academic that just wrote about socialism from the sidelines. But he, first and foremost, he was about building the socialist movement concretely. So I think and just the theme that we've been talking about of Lenin's balance between theory and action, I think that sentence says it all. And you can't have one without the other. And Lenin knew that above all else. So yeah, State and Revolution, really good book. Not that long, easy to get through. I would recommend discussing it with other people. That's how you learn the most, and all of these books too. So yeah, that's my favorite.
Thanks so much. And thanks to all the panelists who participated in celebrating Lenin's 150th birthday. So tune in next week where we're going to have a discussion about International Working Day, May Day, Day Without an Immigrant, depending on where you're living is what you call it. Same time, same place. And don't forget to check out our website, International Socialist Alternative. Thanks, everyone.